It was cold and dreary as Josephina Rivera made her way down 6th Street in North Philadelphia on the night of Wednesday, November 26, 1986. It had been a difficult year for the 25-year-old, who had lost custody of her 3 young children due to her ongoing struggles with drug addiction. With the new year just around the corner, Josephina was determined to make positive changes. Her social worker had promised that if she could find a job and a stable home, she would have a chance at getting her kids back. Needing money to secure an apartment, Josephina had turned to sex work. She was in the process of getting off drugs and making her new home just right, so her social worker could see how serious she was about regaining custody of her children. The following day was Thanksgiving. Josephina intended to make a nice dinner, so she headed out hoping to do a quick job or two for extra cash. She typically found it easy to find willing customers, but being a holiday, the streets were quiet. Josephina could not help but notice that one particular vehicle had driven by her a couple of times. It was a brand new Cadillac Coupe de Ville, the expensive car standing out in the rough and under-resourced neighborhood. Eventually, the Cadillac pulled over. The driver, a white middle-aged male, rolled down his window and asked Josephina if she was working. She responded that she was. The two negotiated a price, and Josephina got into the passenger seat. The man introduced himself as Gary and said he just had to make a quick stop first. The two drove along the quiet street, giving Josephina the chance to get a proper look at Gary. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him. He was of slim build, about 6 feet tall, relatively clean-cut, but with scruffy dark hair and a full beard. He wore jeans and a shabby suede jacket with fringing down the arms, both of which had visible stains. In direct contrast to his somewhat unkempt appearance, Josephina noticed a genuine gold chain around his neck and an expensive Rolex watch on his wrist. Gary stopped at a McDonald's restaurant and grabbed a cup of coffee. Back in the car, he told Josephina he wanted them to go to his house. This was something Josephina did not typically do. She serviced most of her clients in their own cars or nearby motels, getting in and out as quickly as she could. But it was a slow night, and Gary had offered a decent price. There was also nothing about him that raised any red flags. Just this once, Josephina decided to make an exception. Gary drove a few blocks further north into the 25th District, a predominantly black and Hispanic neighborhood notorious for drug-related gang violence. He eventually turned down North Marshall Street, a residential block characterized by deteriorating row houses, most of them 2 or 3 stories high and sharing at least one wall with their neighboring building. Gary pulled up at 35 and 20 North Marshall Street. It was just like all the others, save for a couple of distinct differences. Only one side of Gary's house shared a wall with a neighbor. On the other side was an empty block littered with rubbish. Unlike the surrounding homes, whose front doors opened directly onto the cracked sidewalks, Gary's house was set several feet back, separated from the street by a short chain-link fence. Gary and Josephina got out of the Cadillac and made their way inside. As Gary unlocked the door, Josephina noticed that the key he used was unlike any she had ever seen before. She asked about it, and Gary explained that he had made it himself by sawing the regular key in half so the front part stayed permanently inside the lock. This way, no other key would work except his. Although Josephina thought this was odd, she did not give it much more thought. The inside of Gary's house was otherwise ordinary, albeit sparsely furnished and relatively untidy. The only unusual detail was that Gary had meticulously glued coins into the walls of his kitchen. In the living room, the window was protected by metal bars, which was typical of the area. The room housed a grubby orange couch, a couple of arcade games, a television with a video cassette recorder, and a large stack of video cassette tapes. Josephina caught a quick glance of the handwritten titles and could see that many of them were pornographic films. She followed Gary upstairs, noticing that the walls in the hallway were plastered with dollar bills. Every now and then, there was a $20 bill among them. They went into the bedroom and had consensual sex as agreed. Afterwards, as Josephina got up to get dressed, Gary made some strange small talk. On the drive over, Josephina had told Gary that she had 3 children who were home with a babysitter, and she could not be out long. She had made up the lie about the babysitter so that Gary would not try to make her stay, but instead, it seemed to have sparked his interest. Gary seemed particularly curious about Josephina's fertility, asking if she was still able to have children and probing about whether or not she had had a hysterectomy. Then, out of nowhere, Gary came up behind Josephina and secured his hands firmly around her neck. Having been lucky enough not to have experienced violence on the job before, Josephina was completely caught off guard. It took her a moment to realize what was happening. Images of her life flashed before her in a way that she described as being like a broken film projector. Just as Josephina began to fade into unconsciousness, Gary loosened his grip. Coming to, she started struggling against him, only to realize that he had managed to slip a handcuff over her right wrist. Josephina begged Gary not to hurt her, promising to comply with whatever he wanted. Gary remained completely calm and collected. He said he would not hurt her as long as she stood still. He then proceeded to cuff Josephina's hands behind her back and led her back down the stairs. Once they got to the kitchen, Gary opened another door and led Josephina down a narrow set of steps into a dank, damp basement. It was cold, and the smell of mold filled the air. There was only one small window, more like an air vent, which was covered by a metal flap that blocked any view of the outside world. A single overhead light bulb illuminated the bleak surroundings, which included a white freezer chest, a washing machine, and a bucket. Various bits of debris littered the concrete floor, while sandbags and insulation had been stacked against the walls as soundproofing. Scanning the room, Josephina noticed something in the middle of the floor. A section of concrete had been demolished, and a hole roughly the size of a small bathtub had been dug out underneath. Wondering what purpose this hole could possibly serve, Josephina was struck with a terrifying thought. Was she looking at her own grave? As Josephina stood there naked, Gary proceeded to secure a metal chain around her ankle using a homemade shackle device he had fashioned from a muffler clamp, a small metal bar, and superglue. Methodically, he used a hairdryer to dry the glue before attaching the other end of the chain to a sewer pipe that ran along the ceiling, affixing it with a padlock. This enabled Josephina to move around, but only by shuffling her feet and as far as the 12-foot-long chain would allow. Gary then shoved Josephina into the hole in the basement floor and covered it up with a piece of plywood. It was not until she was in there that she realized just how restrictive it was. Josephina was only 5'6" with a petite frame, but she had to fold her legs against her chest just to fit her whole body inside. And even then, she stuck out too much for the plywood to sit completely flat. To hold it down, Gary secured it by placing a couple of bags of dirt on top. Josephina could barely breathe. Panic gripped her body as she tried to comprehend what was happening. How long did Gary intend to keep her in the hole? Would he even let her out at all? Certain she would run out of air, Josephina sobbed and begged for mercy as her arms started going numb. She screamed for what felt like hours, even though she knew there was no point. Gary had set his radio to a local rock station and was blasting it as loud as it would go. Josephina knew right away this was not to keep her entertained. It was to drown out the sound of her screams. Hour after hour ticked by as Josephina endured the extreme pain and discomfort of being stuck in the hole while also battling hunger, exhaustion, and emotional distress. Her voice cracked and ached from constant screaming. It was pitch black, but she was able to keep track of time thanks to the radio announcements. 20 hours passed before Josephina heard footsteps. Suddenly, her vision was flooded with light as the plywood lid was ripped off the hole. Gary was back in the basement. In his hand was a large stick. He leaned into the hole and began beating Josephina with it, grabbing her by the hair and administering blow after painful blow while repeatedly telling her to shut up. Josephina did as she was told, shocked by the brutality of Gary's actions. Gary then shoved her back into the hole and replaced the plywood lid before disappearing back upstairs. He returned about 30 minutes later with a glass of water, ordering Josephina to get out of the hole and onto an air mattress which had been pushed into the corner of the room. He removed her handcuffs and gave her the water, which she drank thirstily, before Gary proceeded to rape her. Josephina was too exhausted and terrified to fight back. Then, to her dismay, Gary laid down beside her and fell asleep. While he slept, she looked around for possible ways to escape, but she knew it was no use. Gary had not brought the keys to the padlock with him, so there was no way she was getting out of her chains. Then Gary woke up with a start. He immediately hopped up, grabbed a shovel, and got to work widening the hole on the basement floor. As he worked, he chattered candidly to Josephina, telling her that his one dream in life was to raise a big family. He explained that he had fathered 4 different children to 4 different women, but each time the authorities had taken the children away, and he never got to see them again. He spoke with disdain about protective services and the government in general, explaining that he used to work as a medic for the army until they began dosing him with hallucinogenic drugs without his consent. Gary told Josephina that he went to the doctors with a medical complaint, and by the time they finished treating him, he was out of his mind. He said he was discharged from the military and had been in and out of mental health facilities ever since. Most recently, Gary had signed up for a matchmaking service which paired American men with women from the Philippines. He had been matched with a woman named Betty, who flew over to the United States to marry him. But Betty was not the subservient wife that Gary had dreamed of. She got pregnant and ran out on Gary before their baby was born. She now refused to let Gary see his son while suing him for child support. This time, Gary had a plan to make sure that did not happen again. He told Josephina he intended to hold up to 10 women in his basement and impregnate each one. He said he preferred black women and ideally ones he did not consider smart. Once the babies were born, Gary said that they would all raise them together under one roof where no one could interfere, like one big happy family. Josephina listened intently. It occurred to her that not only was Gary deeply unwell, he was also incredibly lonely. She figured her best chance of survival was to play along by lending a sympathetic ear and agreeing with what Gary had to say. After he was done digging, he left Josephina alone in the basement, chained up but free of the handcuffs. She fell to her knees as the gravity of what he told her sank in. Josephina, who was half Puerto Rican and half Mexican, had grown up in a loving foster home after she and her siblings were abandoned by their parents. She adored her foster mother and had enjoyed a comfortable upbringing, going to a good school and on to college. It was only when she discovered drugs that things in her life spiraled out of control. Before her chance encounter with Gary, she had been determined to start the upcoming year with a clean slate. Now, realizing that Gary had no intention of releasing her anytime soon, Josephina began to panic, thinking of her foster mother and children. She prayed to God that she would find the strength to get herself out of this situation. Josephina knew that no one would realize she was missing or be out looking for her. At that moment, she made up her mind that she was not done living, and she was going to get out of that basement no matter what. When Josephina awoke the next day, she was alone in the basement, freezing, and with no concept of time. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her face, body, and mind were weakening. Then she felt vibrations overhead as the engine of Gary's car began revving in the garage and drove away. Realizing this meant she was alone in the house, Josephina wasted no time. Frantically, using all of her remaining strength, she began picking at the super glue on the screw of the right muffler clamp. After about 30 minutes, the screw came loose. Josephina freed her right ankle from the shackles and ran as far as the chain would allow. It was just long enough for her to reach the one small window in the basement. It was only about 1.5 feet wide, but Josephina was sure she would be able to crawl through. She pushed the metal flap on the window and was relieved to feel it open easily, revealing the trash-covered backyard. The welcome sight of daylight flooded into the basement as Josephina tried to hoist herself up. But try as she might, she could not fit her body more than a few inches into the window. Still chained to the pipe by one ankle, this left her with very little wiggle room. Josephina could hear voices nearby and started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. The neighborhood had a large Hispanic population, so she screamed in a blend of English and Spanish, explaining that a man had her chained up and was raping her. She begged someone to call the police, saying this man was going to kill her. Josephina could hear every word of what the people nearby were saying, so she could not understand why they were not responding to her desperate pleas for help. She managed to grab hold of a stick and started whacking the neighboring fence. She did this for almost 20 minutes until finally somebody heard her. But it was not the savior she was hoping for. It was Gary. Gary was back inside the basement. He grabbed the chain, dragging Josephina away from the window in a way that made her feel like a fish on a line. She used all her strength to maintain her position halfway out of the window, still screaming at the top of her lungs. She managed to jam her free foot against the window frame, which effectively secured her in place. Gary let go of the chain, and a minute later, he appeared in the backyard. He stood over Josephina and tried to push her back into the basement from the outside. She continued fighting against him, all the while yelling at him to get off and begging for someone to call the police. After a few minutes, Gary gave up and went back into the basement. This time, he yanked on Josephina's chain so violently that she was sure her leg would break. The pain was so intense that she relented, letting her body flop as Gary pulled her all the way back inside. Seemingly exhilarated by this victory, he said he would have to do a better job of securing her shackles this time. As he got to work regluing the clamps, he assured Josephina that nobody was going to come to her aid. The neighborhood was filled with drug dealers whom he paid to leave him alone. For her attempt to escape, Gary beat Josephina and handcuffed her arms behind her back, leaving her on the hard, cold basement floor. He then bolted the metal flap on the window to the wall and packed the outside with sandbags, sealing off her last possible connection with the outside world. The next day, Gary returned to the basement to give Josephina some bread and water and continue digging out the hole in the ground. He raped her again before ordering her back inside the hole. This time, it was big enough to fit the air mattress inside, and Josephina was able to sit up relatively comfortably compared to the squashed fetal position she had been in previously. She heard Gary leave the house, but instead of being relieved that he was gone, she was filled with fear. Gary was the only one who knew she was down there. It occurred to her that if anything happened to him while he was out, she would be left there to rot. A few hours later, Gary returned, but this time, he was not alone. Josephina could hear 2 sets of footsteps along with a woman crying. Gary was trying to comfort the woman, saying, "Come on, Sandy. You know I am not going to hurt you, right? Why are you crying? You know me. Stop crying." Suddenly, light flooded into the hole as Gary removed the plywood board and yanked Josephina up by the arm. A young black woman who looked to be about the same age as herself stood there, naked, with her hands cuffed behind her back and in an obvious state of distress. Gary introduced the 2 women as though there was nothing unusual about the circumstances in which they were meeting. He then got to work supergluing another muffler clamp shackle to the ankles of his new victim before padlocking her chains to the sewer pipe. Once he was finished, he ordered both women into the hole and sealed them inside. Alone with Gary's new captive, Josephina did her best to calm the woman down. She explained that her name was Sandra Lindsay, and she was 25 years old. She had known Gary for about 4 years. The 2 had met through the Elwyn Institute, a facility in West Philadelphia that provides support and services to individuals with a range of intellectual and physical disabilities. Sandra was intellectually disabled herself, and although she lived relatively independently, her mental capabilities were more aligned with those of a 15-year-old. Gary Heidnik was a qualified nurse who had previously worked at the Elwyn Institute, and the 2 became friends. Sandra explained to Josephina that Gary had always been good to her, sometimes taking her out to amusement parks, fast food restaurants, or to his place. He was also the self-ordained minister of his own church, which catered specifically to people with intellectual and physical disabilities, known as the United Church of the Ministers of God. Gary held weekly sermons at his home on Marshall Street, where he taught hymns and read Bible passages to the small congregation. Sandra was one of the 10 or so followers who attended often. One of the things she liked most about it was that Gary never asked his congregants for money. Earlier that day, Saturday, November 29th, Sandra had been experiencing menstrual cramps and had gone out to buy some painkillers when Gary drove by and offered her a lift. They went out to eat like usual and then back to Gary's house to have sex. Afterwards, he started strangling her and dragged her downstairs. "I do not understand it," Sandra cried. "Gary is my friend. Why is he doing this?" It was clear to Josephina that Sandra did not fully grasp what was going on. She asked Sandra if she had ever had sex with Gary before. Sandra responded that she had had sex with both Gary and a friend of his named Tony Brown. She had once gotten pregnant by Gary and had an abortion, which made Gary angry. Sandra explained, "Now he says I am going to have his baby whether I want to or not." A few hours later, Gary returned to the basement. He laid Josephina and Sandra side by side and raped them both. It struck Josephina that he did not seem to get any particular pleasure from this act. His moves seemed mechanical, reinforcing to her that he was serious about his twisted reproductive mission. Afterwards, he gave the women a shirt each to wear and a portable toilet to use in place of the bucket they had been using so far. Gary then got back to work digging the hole deeper and wider. When they were left alone, Josephina and Sandra speculated between themselves about what his intentions could be. Was he making space for more captives, or did he intend on burying their bodies in there? Josephina focused on trying to figure out who exactly Gary Heidnik was and what made him tick. Through Sandra, she learned that for the most part, Gary was a kind man, but he did not like to be told no. He was highly intelligent with a nursing degree, yet received a full disability pension from the government. He had taught himself how to work the stock market, turning $1,500 into a portfolio of over $500,000 within a decade. He also had schizophrenia and had tried to take his own life on more than one occasion. He was supposed to take a daily dose of a medication called Thorazine, but he did not always do so and instead sometimes hoarded it for an overdose. The thought of this terrified Josephina, already feeling like they were living in a permanent grave. She was just as scared of something happening to Gary as she was of something happening to herself. A few days after Sandra's abduction, the women heard someone knocking at the front door. It was Sandra's sister wanting to know if Sandra was there. Shortly after, Gary came downstairs wearing a pair of rubber gloves and holding a pen and paper. He handed these to Sandra and ordered that she write a message. "Dear Mom, do not worry. We'll call. Love, Sandy." In her childlike handwriting, Sandra did as she was told. She then wrote her mother's address on an envelope and sealed the letter inside. After this, Gary locked Sandra and Josephina in the hole and left the house, saying he was going to New York to send the letter so that Sandra's family would not come looking for her at his place again. As each hour ticked by, Josephina was gripped by panic at the thought that Gary was not coming back. Over 24 hours passed before Josephina felt the vibrations of Gary's car pulling into the garage. She was relieved by the sound and told him as much. Little did she know this was a huge mistake. Gary froze. "How did you hear my car?" he asked. Only then did it occur to Josephina that the blaring radio had been to prevent her and Sandra from hearing his movements as much as it had been to prevent outsiders from hearing their screams. Silently, Gary went back upstairs. He returned to the basement shortly after with a screwdriver. He pushed Sandra and then Josephina onto the ground. "Do not scream," he warned as he inserted the screwdriver into their ears. "I know how far I can go without making you deaf." With this, a routine was established. Every morning, Gary came down with some bread and water. He would then rape Josephina and Sandra before continuing work on the hole. If either woman ever put up a fight or screamed, Gary beat them, often with the handle of his shovel, so they quickly learned to comply. Josephina decided that her best chance of survival was to keep quiet and submit to Gary's demands no matter what. Whenever Gary left the house, he sealed Josephina and Sandra into the hole. He soon brought down a battery-powered television, which he let the women take into the hole with them. The pair discovered that leaving the TV on too long deprived them of precious oxygen, so they had to ration their viewing time to no more than 2 hours per day. All the while, the radio blared in the background for hours on end, playing a rotation of the same 10 or so songs, which drove the women mad. Boredom and hunger became constant. Over time, Gary started bringing down tea bags and sugar, along with an old coffee pot that the women could use to boil water. They tried to ration the tea bags, but loaded each drink with as much sugar as they could handle, desperate for the calories. Gary gave the women sanitary products, but at no point were they allowed to bathe. Their only method of cleaning themselves was the occasional baby wipe Gary gave them. By Monday, December 22, 1986, almost a month had passed since Josephina Rivera and Sandra Lindsay had been held captive at Gary Heidnik's home on North Marshall Street. That night, the two women were lying on the air mattress when the basement door opened suddenly. In came Gary with a young black woman, naked and in handcuffs. He introduced the woman as Lisa, chatting jovially as Lisa sobbed. He got to work fitting her with his trademark muffler clamp shackles and chain. Like with the others, Gary was meticulous about the way he fitted Lisa's restraints. He counted the number of chain links between her ankles to ensure he could still rape her with these. He also made sure to chain each woman several feet apart so there was enough space for him to rape them one at a time. With Lisa secured to the chain, he then forced her into the hole, sealed her inside, and went back upstairs. Josephina and Sandra immediately raced over and started talking into the hole, reassuring Lisa that everything would be okay. They told her to do as Gary said, and there would not be any problems. He came back down shortly after, bringing bread and water for the women. He let Lisa out of the hole until they all ate their meals before Gary laid them down and raped them individually. He then handed Lisa a shirt before disappearing back upstairs. Josephina and Sandra learned that Gary's latest victim was 19-year-old Lisa Thomas, a single mother who lived with her own mother and young son approximately 2 miles away. Lisa had been walking to retrieve a pair of gloves she had left at a friend's place when Gary pulled over in his Cadillac, mistaking her for a sex worker. Although Lisa was insulted by this, she could not help but be impressed by his expensive car. Gary apologized for the misunderstanding and offered Lisa a ride to make up for it. Lisa thought that Gary seemed nice, and she was allured by the prospect of showing up at her friend's house in a flashy car, so she accepted. After collecting the gloves from her friend, Lisa accepted Gary's offer to join him for dinner. The pair went to a casual dining restaurant for cheeseburgers and fries. As they ate, Gary invited Lisa to accompany him on a trip to Atlantic City the following day. She found herself somewhat intrigued by him. On the outside, he appeared somewhat scruffy and unkempt, but his expensive car and the way he splashed money around led her to wonder if he was secretly wealthy. Lisa told Gary she had nothing to wear, but that was not a problem for Gary. He offered to take her to a nearby department store after dinner where she could have $50 to spend on whatever she wanted. Pleased with how the evening was panning out, Lisa agreed to join Gary at his home on Marshall Street to show off her new outfits and watch a movie. She did not really want to, but felt she owed it to him after how generous he had been. It was only when Lisa saw his dirty home in the downtrodden neighborhood that she realized she had been wrong about his millionaire status. Keeping her disappointment to herself, they sat down to watch a movie together. Lisa started drinking a wine cooler, but she had also taken an allergy pill over dinner, and the combination of the two made her increasingly drowsy. Before she knew it, she had passed out completely. When she woke up, the realization dawned on her that she was in Gary's bed, completely naked. Lisa consented to having sex with Gary, and when she asked for a ride home afterwards, he launched an attack. Lisa Thomas's story was becoming all too familiar to Josephina Rivera. Gary had established a clear pattern, and he showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. But with 3 women now in the basement, there was not enough room for all of them in the hole. Josephina used this to her advantage. She had been carefully observing Gary's behavior for weeks and had learned that above all else, what he wanted was praise and adoration. He wanted to feel like the women wanted to be there with him, not that they had to. With this in mind, Josephina worked on strengthening her relationship with Gary by assuring him that she was not going anywhere. This tactic worked, and Gary started leaving Josephina in the basement, while Sandra and Lisa were still confined to the hole. Eventually, he started bringing the women upstairs one by one so they could bathe, though their chains were always kept on. During these few minutes alone, Josephina engaged Gary in conversation to learn as much about him as she could. He repeated his plan about bringing several more women to the basement so he could impregnate each one and raise a large group of babies. Gary's parents had divorced when he was 3 years old, after which his mother went on to remarry several more times. Both her second and third husbands were black, and she began telling Gary that he was of mixed race, having had multiple affairs while married to his father. Gary said he wanted to create the perfect race with no influence from the outside world. His dream for the future was that white and black people would procreate for hundreds of years until there was only one race. Only then did he believe the world would be at peace. While Josephina could sense that Gary was softening towards her, this did little to change the reality of the situation. In their darkest moments, the three captives discussed the possibility of launching an attack against Gary, but without the keys to their padlocks, they knew it was no use. If they managed to kill him or knock him unconscious, they would still be chained to the pipes and left there to starve. Christmas Day was a particularly bleak time for all three women. As the radio announcers wished everyone a happy holiday, it was a quiet day for Josephina, Sandra, and Lisa as they thought about their loved ones celebrating without them. Sandra's letter had seemingly thrown her family off Gary's scent, and while Lisa was sure her mother would be looking for her, they had no way of knowing for sure. Besides, they knew how prevalent crime was in the area, with over 300 homicides a year. The police already had their work cut out for them. Gary tried to lighten the mood with an unexpected surprise. He came into the basement with a menu for a Chinese restaurant, telling the women they could order one dish each. When their meals came, they saved every mouth-watering bite, relishing the rare feeling of being properly full. Afterwards, Gary ordered the women to lay down, and he took turns raping them. But even this could not break their spirits. The next few days went by as per usual. As the new year approached, Josephina was consumed with longing for her children and mother on the outside. She knew she could not tolerate her living conditions much longer. Regardless, she was grateful for the company of Sandra and Lisa. Having one another to talk to and share the experience with was the only thing keeping them from falling apart completely. When Gary was not around, they passed the hours chatting among themselves about their lives, families, and relationships on the outside. Then came New Year's Eve 1986, and with it, a new arrival. Gary Heidnik's three captives heard of Deborah Dudley before they laid eyes on her. The 23-year-old sex worker had found herself at Marshall Street the same way as the others, having accepted a ride from Gary. But unlike the rest of them who had entered the basement shaking and crying in fear, Deborah was immediately combative. Naked and handcuffed, Deborah fought against Gary with all her might as he began fitting her ankles with muffler clamps. She screamed in his face, swearing and yelling for him to let her go. The other women looked on in terror. When Deborah saw them there, she began screaming at them too. Once Gary managed to restrain Deborah, he ordered her to get into the hole. She refused, saying there was no way she was going down there. Incensed, Gary picked up his shovel and began beating Deborah with the handle. He shoved her into the hole, covered it with the plywood lid, and placed several bags of dirt on top before disappearing back upstairs. In the hole, the other three women began reassuring Deborah that it would all be okay if she just stopped fighting. They told her about Gary's deranged plans to impregnate them all and advised her to just do what he said. But Deborah was not hearing it. She constantly screamed at the others to let her out, and every time Gary came into the basement from then on, she hollered and fought against him. For Josephina, Deborah's determination was somewhat admirable. It turned out that Deborah had lived a hard life surrounded by crime, drugs, and abuse, and she had had to fight every day to survive. But her refusal to submit to Gary's demands also brought a new level of discord to the situation at Marshall Street. The other women watched on as Gary beat Deborah constantly. He began looking for new objects to discipline her with, remarking that nothing he did seemed to make any difference. Eventually, Gary became so frustrated that he started ordering the others to beat Deborah on his behalf. As traumatizing as she found it, Josephina did not dare to refuse. She apologized to Deborah afterwards, pleading with her to stop screaming and to just comply. She explained that Gary was mentally ill and their best chance of survival was to do whatever he said. Deborah refused. She called Josephina weak for going along with things for as long as she had and said it was time for them to come up with a proper plan to overcome Gary. After all, there were 4 of them and only 1 of him. Josephina repeatedly explained that without the keys to their padlocks, it was no use, but Deborah was not having any of it. She was convinced that someone would hear them if they screamed loud and long enough. Gary started bringing the other women more substantial foods like oatmeal, rice, shriveled hot dog sausages, and Pop-Tarts while continuing to feed Deborah nothing but bread and water. Life continued on like this for 2 more weeks until Sunday, January 18th, 1987, when there was an unexpected change in routine. By this point, Josephina Rivera had been held at Marshall Street for 7.5 weeks, Sandra Lindsay for 7, Lisa Thomas for almost 4, and Deborah Dudley for 18 days. That afternoon, the basement door burst open, and in came Gary with 18-year-old Jackie Asins. Jackie was a sex worker who had been waiting on a corner roughly 3.5 miles from Gary's house when Gary pulled up. Jackie had been working alongside another woman, and they started arguing over which one of them should get his business. Jackie lied to Gary, warning him that the other woman had a sexually transmitted disease and he should pick her instead. To Jackie's delight, Gary did just that. While she did not typically go home with her clients, Gary had a cake on his back seat, which he said was for his daughter's birthday, and he needed to get it into the fridge. Gary seemed harmless, so Jackie agreed. She was playing one of the arcade games in his living room when he suddenly grabbed her in a headlock from behind. Jackie put up a fight, but it was no use. Gary managed to handcuff her and drag her down the steps into the basement. Jackie was visibly terrified. She screamed for Gary to let her go, but this only resulted in a beating. Gary warned Jackie there would be plenty more of that if she did not obey his commands. As soon as Gary left, Josephina went over to Jackie and told her to be quiet. "I am going to get you out of here," she said, "but you have got to be patient." By the next evening, Gary's mood was markedly different. It was Josephina's 26th birthday, and he surprised the group with a special treat like he had done at Christmas. He handed the women a menu for a Chinese restaurant and told them to order 1 dish each. He returned shortly after with the food, a cake, and a present for Josephina, a pair of red fluffy slippers. He cracked open a bottle of sparkling cider and danced with Josephina to the song Purple Rain by Prince. But it was not just the birthday or the introduction of his latest victim that gave Gary Heidnik cause to celebrate. He had reason to believe that both Josephina and Sandra were pregnant. For Josephina, the realization that her period was 2 months late sparked mixed feelings. On one hand, the possibility that she could be pregnant with Gary Heidnik's baby sickened her to the core. On the other hand, she wondered whether Gary would treat her better if she was carrying his child. The slippers he gave her seemed like a good sign that her plan to befriend him was working. Josephina reasoned that he would not give a present to somebody he did not like, and he certainly had not given this type of treatment to any of the others. On the downside, it was clear that the other women were not happy about the positive attention she was receiving. The general vibe between the group was beginning to sour. With the number of captives growing, Gary started implementing a kind of hierarchy system. Given that Josephina, Sandra, and Lisa had been there the longest and were the most compliant, they were allowed out of the hole and to sleep on a regular mattress. Deborah's rebellious behavior earned her a near-constant spot in the hole, while Jackie, as the newest captive, was mostly kept in there with her. Gary began pitting the women against one another by leaving one of them in charge whenever he left them alone. He would encourage the one in charge to tell on the others if they misbehaved. Those who fell out of line received beatings, extra time in the hole, or worse still, they were subjected to a stretched torture device that Gary introduced in late January. He installed a hook into a ceiling rafter and forced the disobedient woman to stand suspended by a single handcuff, her arms held overhead for hours with her feet barely able to touch the floor. The sexual assaults also remained a daily occurrence. Sometimes Gary raped just one woman. Other times he would go from one to the next or force the women to perform sex acts on each other. If they submitted without a fight, he would reward them with treats such as March 23, 1987. Josephina Rivera escaped and called 911. Police arrested Gary Heidnik at a gas station. The three remaining captives, Lisa Thomas, Jackie Asins, and Agnes Adams, were rescued from the basement. Sandra Lindsay was already dead. Deborah Dudley was also dead. Gary was charged with over 50 crimes, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. June 1988. The jury found Gary Heidnik guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours on the penalty. Sentence: death. July 6, 1999. Gary Heidnik was executed by lethal injection in Pennsylvania. He remains the last person executed in Pennsylvania to this day. Josephina Rivera said, "I'm never Josephina Rivera. I'm always Heidnik victim. It's never over."